Thanks, everybody. Welcome to Build. I'm your host, Ricky Camilleri. In 1992, Cameron Todd Willingham was sentenced to death for the murders of his 3 small children in a Texas house fire. In 2004, at the age of 36, he was put to death. Following his death, the majority of the evidence against Willingham has not just been called into question, but wholly debunked, leading to the Innocence Project filing a lawsuit against the state of Texas. The new film, Trial by Fire by the great Edward Zwick, tells Willingham's story with a powerful performance by Jack O'Connell as Willingham and Laura Dern as a regular woman wrapped up in proving his innocence. Let's take a look.
Cameron Todd Willingham, you are guilty of capital murder. By order of the state of Texas, you are sentenced to death.
You're my first visitor in a long time.
How long has it been?
8 years. Prisoners talk about doing time. On the road, there is no time. The clock stopped moving the minute we was sentenced.
How about you tell me what happened?
Girl! Help me! Any man can't save his own kids. Don't deserve to live. But I did not kill my own children, Elizabeth. I love them more than I love life itself.
I found myself talking to a vulnerable, sensitive man. I believe the state of Texas is about to kill an innocent man. You failed to challenge witnesses that changed their story.
He had the motive, he had the means. That boy is a monster, and he will die.
His lawyer decided Todd was guilty from the get-go. He failed to find a single scientific expert.
Doesn't mean he's innocent. Don't let your emotions get the better of you.
My emotions? What? Because I'm a woman? Great. I'm gonna go finish your job for you.
You ever read Man's Search for Meaning? He says, to live is to suffer. And to survive, you gotta find meaning in the suffering. I wanna live.
That's why we're not gonna give up. Why do you think Todd Willingham confessed to you?
I ain't supposed to talk about this stuff,
Who told you not to talk about it? The district attorney? They are gonna kill an innocent person.
I got a gun. Get out of here then!
These so-called experts
Didn't even bother to check the space heater.
There's no arson, there's no crime.
It ain't gonna make no difference. Liz, I'm not here to be safe. I am here to die.
What chance we got, honestly?
You think this is just about Todd? The system doesn't work. It's broken.
These are my last days, Liz. If I start hoping, he's gonna go by just like that.
I understand, but I'm hoping.
Everybody, please welcome writer Geoffrey Fletcher, director Edward Zwick, Jack O'Connell, and Laura Dern from Trial by Fire. Hi.
Hello.
Thanks so much for being here. Edward, this is a 10-year project for you. You've been working on this basically since the New Yorker article came out.
Yep.
Is that true?
Yep, we read David Grand's article in, I guess, 2009. We were so moved by it that we thought that the only thing we could possibly do was to make a movie. We didn't know it was going to take us 10 years.
Why did it take you 10 years?
I think that it's not an obvious commercial bet for a financier to do that. I think Geoffrey had to work for a while on the script. We had to find the perfect cast, and you know, life just time seems to go by. But when you're doing something that you're very committed to, time does have a different meaning, and it does pass because you just believe in where you're going to get to. And what seems to have happened is the culture has shifted even in those 10 years, where criminal justice reform, which is something that we were very concerned with when starting to write the movie, has now bubbled up even, and there's some, you know, bipartisan support of the beginning of it at least, and so now it's an irony that maybe have been to the benefit of the movie.
Plus we had to allow for some time for the mullet to happen.
That's a 10-year mullet, huh?
Approximately 8.5, yeah.
Wow, unreal. How did you hide it when you were doing other movies? Did you just sort of bald cap the mullet in?
Yeah, you'd be surprised, you know, the things he
What
can
they
do.
can do with makeup effects these days?
Magic. Yeah, film magic.
Jack, Laura, what drew you to this movie, and when did you get on board?
The mullet, I think, was really
The mullet was
the
a
reason.
strong draw, wasn't
Yeah,
it, for I
for
think
me
everyone.
too.
You were
Really?
unsure, and then Jack walked into the room with the mullet. Ed was like, let me show you something here.
I'm surprised it didn't make the poster.
Yeah.
Just the mullet.
Well, certainly for me, the privilege of working with Ed and being such an admirer of his work. And then before I read the script, he gave me the article. David Gran wrote an extraordinary article in The New Yorker, which really gives you such a deep sense of the case and the injustice in the case. And then, of course, Geoffrey's amazing script. And we started these incredible conversations about not only what happened in Todd's case, but also Ed's longing, which I was so moved by, to tell a parallel story of how small acts of kindness can impact not only the two individuals involved, but change culture, perhaps. So that was my in.
Yeah, you know, there's a scene with your character where, you know, I think this is something where we can say we don't have to worry about spoilers, right? It's a story that everybody knows, but there's a scene with your character that doesn't just feel reflective of the story of Todd, but reflective of the moment right now, which is like a very cruel world and politics that are based on campaigning off of cruelty in a lot of ways, where your character says to her daughter, "I just didn't want you to know that the world could be so shitty." I don't know if I'm paraphrasing. I feel like that is the line.
Pretty close, yeah.
Yeah. And that felt so real and honest to me right now, because even when we see Rick Perry in the final moment, we do have this world where everybody is just campaigning off of who can be the cruelest.
Well, I think Laura and I think that line came out of a realization that we had each in various ways had to say that to our children.
Geoffrey, can you talk about writing the script and trying to find, even as much as this took place, I mean, Todd was executed in 2004, and the majority of this movie takes place over the course of the 90s, but finding ways to run parallel to right now. Did you think about that while you were writing the script?
Well, I think a story about justice is appropriate for any era, and sometimes the times kind of catch up to this ideal you strive for. And so I think a thing that Ed and I discussed quite a bit was structuring it. You know, a story with so many layers and events is, you know, finding your way in and where Elizabeth comes in. And so ultimately, I think in the best case scenario, you aren't telling the story's telling you.
Jack, can you talk about portraying Todd and giving him a somewhat unsentimental portrayal as well?
Well, yeah. Well, I think any sentimental, anything you take from it that is sentimental kind of just happens by coincidence in a way. Because it didn't seem right to kind of set it up too much for the audience. And it was nice to be allowed to be dislikable and demonstrate these dislikable traits, because they have a significance eventually when he comes to being tried.
He's his own worst enemy in the trial at times.
Yeah. And so it wasn't a case of trying to portray somebody who is, you know, obviously innocent. I think a lot of the conflict, quite a lot of the drama comes within the process of trying to make up your own mind. For the audience, that's the hope anyway.
I would add that it's so common for other actors, and I'll mention no names, to be self-protective, to worry about the audience's sympathy, and to therefore be hesitant and reluctant to do those kind of things that Jack does in the movie, because that requires a certain amount of courage, but also an understanding of your commitment to the authenticity of the character.
And that bravery with his choice exemplifies the horrors of the criminal justice system when it comes to profiling. So it was so essential to the story we were all trying to tell.
Well, I'm wondering about your self-protection as a director with an agenda, because you have said that this is a film with an agenda, and I think it's a good agenda, and it's a necessary agenda. But when you go into telling this story, do you worry that not sentimentalizing him in some way or making him this clear picture of innocence in any way undercuts your agenda? Like, you're writing two lines there,
Yeah.
Good art versus the agenda.
Sure. Well, I mean, look, Jeff and I talked about this a lot. I mean, we felt it was important that the audience condemn this man, as did that jury in Corsicana, Texas. And having done that, you're obliged to then follow the rest and become complicit in his fate. And that's a very, we felt the possibility of a very participatory experience in a movie, which is, I think, what people want.
Laura, can you talk about the real woman that your character is based on?
Yes, Elizabeth Gilbert was incredibly generous. You know, experiencing her own heartbreak and trauma from her life, and what happened to Todd ultimately, and yet still was very generous with her time with me, and also shared all of Liz and Todd's personal letters back and forth as they developed their relationship, which I think was so insightful for Jack and I, and to really, it also tells a profound story of healing that was occurring within this man in the time he was incarcerated, because you watch his behavior, his availability, his education, his longing, his spiritual longing, over the years of the letter writing.
How long was the letter writing period?
Years.
It was years, and I know that it stopped for a while and then picked up again. I'm not sure the exact periods each time.
Jack, this is your second prison drama, I believe, right?
Well, I think, strictly speaking, I've been incarcerated 3 times.
3 times?
4 times.
4 times?
I think 4 times, yeah.
What I'm thinking of Startup and this, what were the other 2?
I think Louis Zamperini was in a prisoner of war camp, wasn't he? So,
right, there you go, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have any hesitation when it comes to playing a prisoner again, since you've done it once or twice?
I will have going forward. Yeah. I think there's only so many times you want to kind of sing the same tune. But I don't know if that's strictly true, because each example varies
Very
quite,
different,
quite drastically. So I don't know, I just must have one of them faces. People think needs locking up. I don't know.
Can you talk about that? You know, there is a slight adjustment to who Todd becomes as the movie progresses. He does become a different person, and he does sort of have to atone a little bit for what he believes were his sins prior to his incarceration. Can you talk about crafting that performance and that change? Because it's not a humongous change. He doesn't really become an angel or anything. He just becomes a little more thoughtful.
A little more thoughtful, and perhaps more accepting of the truth in a way that his situation is shit. And if he's going to keep mentally wrestling that every day, I guess that could be quite exhausting, perhaps, you know, to the point of potentially making him insane. So I find it very interesting what happens to a person when they're put in an environment where their freedom has been stripped. Their choices are very limited anyway. There isn't a lot more to do other than potentially educate yourself and try and in some way expand the mind and try and expand the parameters of his confinement. So that's something I've always found interesting with the story of incarceration, and going one way compared to potentially going the other way, which is probably a bit more of a road to ruin kind of thing. But yeah, it's just something I find personally interesting. You know,
the other way is more of the startup way of trying to be the leader of the pack rather than educating and opening yourself up.
Yeah, I suppose so. Yeah. But I think, you know, either predicament there are quite distinct from each other. You know, like being on death row is perhaps a different ordeal altogether. Yeah.
You know, one of the most, I think, heartbreaking relationships in the film is the one that Todd has with his guard, who becomes something else by the end of the film, which was very unexpected. And even that is a subtle, unsentimental portrayal. And I'm wondering if you could talk about crafting that relationship and not giving that relationship that sort of like a very big Hollywood moment.
Well, I think all relationships in the piece, you know, Ed was really wanted them to have a humanity. You know, certainly you have our leads, but when you have such a profound moment, if it can sort of ripple out and affect the other characters in perhaps the same way it could possibly affect an audience, but to have 3-dimensional characters everywhere, See, that's the kind of 3D I like. You don't need the glasses. You know?
I do, unfortunately, when I'm watching things. Ed, can you talk about that relationship?
Yeah, well, I mean, we met a lot of guards. Todd wrote about guards who had been cruel, guards who had been kind, and one guard said to me, he said, "You realize that jailers spend their life in prison." And proximity, I have found often with people that I might have felt I had great difference with, over time, those barriers break down and you find some commonality of experience. And there was another guard that we spoke to who had been one of those men who they would alternate, who would actually turn those knobs or who would, attach to the leg, who had a nervous...
The lethal injection.
Yeah, the injection in the chamber. And he had a nervous breakdown and in fact has become an anti-death penalty advocate in his own home. And we were just moved to think that would be a way of actually reflecting what Todd's arc had been, having to do with connection, that to have a real connection with someone, even an unexpected one, or maybe another unexpected one, that would reflect his growth.
I hate to be nostalgic, but you said it took you 10 years to get this film made, and you came up in a period of time in the late 80s and in the 90s when a movie like this, I think, would have been made based off of the story alone. They would have said, this is a great story, it has something to say. Here is $25 million, go make a great movie. And that just doesn't exist anymore. What is it like at this stage of your career to believe in a story so much but have to fight so much harder than you did when you were younger, when you probably had more fight in you to get a movie made?
Yeah, well, look, the major studios have abdicated serious drama, essentially. And look, some of the things that are being done on the streaming services are marvelous. I take nothing away from them. But their design is to create these hours that end with an inconclusive, almost Dickensian ending, that cliffhanger that makes you want to then anxiously go to the next. And what it deprives you of, at least for me, is that catharsis and denouement that is a theatrical experience that I relate to as having been most important to me in movies. A single, compelling, strong moment in my life that I can point to when I saw that movie, sitting there in the dark, alone, that moved me. And we just felt that this should be a movie. And so it was worth fighting for whatever it took to maybe give a certain number of people that experience.
Laura, you've been able to sort of really straddle the line between doing big budget Hollywood comic book movies, or Star Wars at least, not necessarily a comic book, and doing small dramas like this and episodic work like Big Little Lies. How has that been for you? Do you like all of them the same? Is there a part of you that still really feels I'll use all of that to try to get something like this made as well?
All of it. Yes to everything you said. I love all of it. I love being an actor. I love the opportunity to have done so many different kinds of things. No matter what I've done, it always seems to be focused on the filmmaker, the opportunity to work with the filmmaker and the narrative they're telling.
That's been since the beginning of your career, though.
Yeah,
going back to David Lynch, or even before that with Smooth Talk. That was based on an incredible short story.
Yeah.
Was that something that you learned from your parents? They were like, follow the storyteller?
100%. And that the collaboration and witnessing as a little girl, both my parents are actors, so witnessing their collaboration with a great filmmaker and what it would inspire drove me to want to do this. But I was raised, previous even to the 90s, as you referred to, the movies my parents showed me and the movies that inspired me, from Network to Dog Day Afternoon, 3 Days of the Condor, Norma Ray. I mean, they were the films you waited in long lines to see that drama play out. And Trial by Fire would have been a perfect movie of that era that we would long for. Kramer versus Kramer, movies about people going through the deepest of conflict that we can find relatable, and it gave us an opportunity to have empathy. The
King
movie
of Marvin
didn't need to do
Gardens,
that.
which your father was in, which is such a weird movie of that time, and the fact that people lined up to see that. I watched that now, and I'm like, this is a slow, meandering drama about internal struggle, and it's like 2.5 hours long, and it was a box office success.
Yeah, exactly. But it's why we love doing what we do. So I feel privileged to get to be in a film like this, and as much as I love everything else, but this is where my heart is.
You know, you have a love for the filmmaker, and I want to ask one quick question about Big Little Lies, because you've gone from Jean-Marc Vallée to Andrea Arnold, who is in her own right, I think, one of the great filmmakers working right now. What has it been like to go from Vallée to Andrea Arnold she's doing the whole season, isn't she?
Yeah, she did, and you know, it's like everything. What's amazing is to watch a filmmaker bring their heart to something, not just their vision. And in series television, it's interesting because we made a limited series that for us was a movie, and we weren't going to come back and do it again necessarily. So in a way, it was a great surprise, and to watch someone step into another's vision, an established character, but to bring her heart into these characters, into their homes, and want to explore them in her own unique way is a beautiful thing to watch.
Ed, I mean, obviously what you would like people to take away from this is that the death penalty is barbaric, it is cruel, and it should be abolished within this country. But what else would you like people to take away from it?
Well, I mean, the reason that I always would go to the movies is because I wanted to go someplace in my imagination or in my experience that would otherwise have been forsworn to me. This was an opportunity to feel something I hadn't ever felt, to see something I didn't know about, and to therefore to grow. But particularly as it pertained to a connection between two people who, in the worst of circumstance, managed to create meaning. And I think the creation of meaning in our lives is a very important subject. And how we do it, no matter if we're on death row or we're just living our daily life. How does that happen? And when does that happen? And how open are we to that happening? And that to me, when put in the context of imminent death and a sentence, is a metaphor that we're all sentenced in some way, and our time is short, in fact. And what do we do at that time? And to me, that spoke to me in a very deep way.
And I'd like to add to that, because another thing we thought about is when you leave this movie, go out back into your life, maybe you think a little differently when you're serving on a jury or when you're voting, or how you consume news about crime. And in many respects, that makes it a happy ending. You know what a sad ending is? A sad ending is a false happy ending. And so here, his story, Elizabeth's story, will be told, and I don't know how you could experience their story and not look at things the same way you did before, even if you're on the other side of the issue. And as Roger Ebert said, these things are empathy machines. And right now, we could use that kind of machine out in the world.
May I chime in?
Of course.
We were talking last night a little bit about the bases on which people tend to vote on politically. And in some cases, and maybe through an influence of popular culture, for instance, the reasoning seems to become less and less in depth. I read an article in a newspaper that I trust that said they were interviewing a fella about, this is at home, about Brexit. And the guy actually said, he was like, I'm voting out of Europe because we keep finishing last in Eurovision, which is like a European song contest. And that was one of the contributing factors for him wanting to remove the country out of the EU. So, superficial factors like that, and do they have a place in politics?
Well, there's also the element, not to go tangential on my own thing over here, but there's also the element that we've reached this place where there is some form of cruelty that is bubbling up, that I think even when people are polled or asked or surveyed, they answer the question in the way that they think the reporter or the person reading it will hate it. And I don't know where that has come from, but you read polls and people are advocating for the cruelest possible thing just because they think it's going to piss somebody off that reads about it.
But contradictory to that, there is also a strain that I identify in the identification of injustice that we're all reacting against. I see that all different forms. I see it in this trope of, say, the serial, that podcast, or the making of the murder on Netflix. I think there's an interest and some reaction to all the injustice, the unfairness that we sense around us. I think there's a reason for it politically at this moment, because we watch people violating norms and going unpunished, and I think that we react to it.
How do you remain positive while you've been making this film for 10 years, and throughout the first 7 of those 10 years, or 6 of those 10 years, there's the Obama administration. It seemed like certain elements of progressivism were moving forward, albeit slowly, but were happening, and the administration wasn't perfect. But then after that, like we've said, we've come to this administration that is solely based on cruelty often. How do you remain positive, or at least...
It's funny you evoke Obama, because he would cite the Dr. King quote about the arc of the moral universe bending toward justice. Well, indeed, that whole quote is that the arc of the moral universe is long, and it bends toward justice. And I think it may be an irony that while the Obama administration was going on and one had a sense of things being more sanguine, that there might not have been the urgency felt to make this kind of a movie. Alex Soros, with whom I'd been involved on the board of a group called Global Witness, someone I'd known for a very long time, their foundation has contributed a great deal to criminal justice reform. But it was only 2 or 3 years ago when he said to me, I think this is a film you need to make and I can help. And I think he might have been driven or animated by his perception of this moment.
That the cruelty of the administration and the injustice that we're seeing on a federal level is affecting how we view something like this.
And interesting, since we're in New York, maybe you can also share, given the current president, a case of injustice.
Well, no, look, Donald Trump called for the death of the Central Park Five in a full-page ad before they'd even been tried, and ultimately exonerated. He also has called for the death to drug dealers. So the issue of the death penalty, I think, in fact, is very much alive in America now, and I hope will become part of the conversation.
Absolutely. I think we have time for a couple questions from the audience. Who is it? Right here.
Hello, you guys. My question to Lauren Dern. How's it like working with Carrie Fisher in the Star Wars movie? Because I met Mark Hamill 2 years ago.
Well, it was an incredible privilege. She has the greatest wit and genius brain I had ever been around. No one had ever been faster at coming up with a comeback or a line or a phrase, but I felt very blessed to honor Leia in getting to work with her, and my character, in fact, honors Leia in the film. So it was very moving to have that experience, and and heartbreaking. But as a little girl who had such hero worship about Princess Leia, it was amazing to be there with her.
By the way, I'd like to say, I wish you all luck.
Thank you.
One more question.
Hi, guys. I have a question from our website buildseries.com. Do you recommend reading the New York article or Googling the case before seeing the film?
Wow. I actually think it might even be better to see the film and then read the article. Definitely to do both, but that would be the order I would recommend.
Thank you.
Well, guys, congratulations on the film. It opens this weekend, this Friday, limited release, and then it'll expand in the following weeks, correct?
We hope.
Guys, see the movie.
Go see the
Tell
movie.
everyone you know.
It's an incredible story and incredibly well made by this group of people right here. Please give them a huge round of applause for coming.